Well, it looks like our feed is live. Um, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. My name is John Woodward. I'm the Director of Museums for the Wyoming Military Department. And today we are privileged to have Lieutenant Colonel retired Don Miles, United States Air Force, who will be our guest presenter. Uh, just to talk a little bit before, as an introduction and some housekeeping before I turn it over. Uh, our presentation today is titled The B-17 and the B-24 World War II, or excuse me, World War II U.S. Heavy Bombers. And about our presentation, the losses were heavy, but the B-17 and B-24 played a key role in the Allied defeat of Germany in World War II. Our presentation today will talk about the production of these complex aircraft, what it took to get the aircraft and crews combat ready, and we'll hear a little bit more about some of the missions in which they flew. Some of these crews trained here in Casper at the Casper Army Air Base. The United States built over 31,000 heavy bombers during the war, but sadly today only 8 are in flying condition. As for our presentation, please hold your questions till the end. If you do have questions when we get to the end of the stream, please put those into the chat feed, and we'll do some moderation at the end of the program. Also, just since the chat is open to everyone, please be considerate of other people. If it starts to get a little raucous, I will disable the chat feed. But with that, I will turn it over to our presenter, Don Miles.
Well, thank you, John. Little disclaimer here first. Many of the images that are used in the presentation I've put together here belong to other people. So they're used under the fair use provision of the Copyright Act of 1976. So welcome to the presentation on heavy bombers in World War II. My name is Don Miles, and I'm a docent at the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. For this presentation, I've tried to provide a look at the US-made heavy bombers and how they were used in World War II. The recent TV series, Masters of the Air, provides much of the human drama that I couldn't really capture in this presentation, and I highly recommend you take a look at that. B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were key to the Allied victory over Germany during World War II, and they were the first strategic bombers used by the US. In the presentation, we'll look at the aircraft, how they evolved, touch on the training in the air crews had to go through, including the training at the Casper Army Air Base, and look at the missions. More than 18,000 B-24s and more than 12,000 B-17s were built for World War II. Near the end of the presentation, we'll take a look at where the surviving aircraft went after the war. There were 12,000 B-24s and 7,000 B-17s. To understand why the US developed heavy bombers, must first look at the intended use of that weapon system. Heavy bombers were developed to conduct strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is a strategy to destroy a country's ability or will to fight by attacking its homeland from the air. That includes factories, railways, refineries, and other infrastructure that produce or supplied war materials. A secondary goal is to demoralize the citizens. Air power advocates in World War II believed that strategic bombing could win wars. But at the start of World War II, the theory was unproven. Germany had used strategic bombing in its attack on Great Britain. Had Hitler not decided to open the Eastern Front in June of 1941 and attack the Soviet Union, historians say it would have only been a matter of weeks before Great Britain would have had to surrender. But in the end, it was Allied bombing in both Europe and the Pacific that brought an end to World War II. For the United States and the United Kingdom, strategic bombing doctrine was different. The RAF favored night missions, which limited the capabilities of enemy fighters, but also limited the accuracy of the bombing. The United States subscribed to pinpoint daylight bombing. And once the US joined the war in Europe, this difference in doctrine led to round the clock bombing raids, the US during the day and the RAF during the night. For World War II, the US produced and used the two heavy bombers, the consolidated B 24 Liberator and the Boeing B 17 Flying Fortress. Let's take a look at each of them. Others are much more eloquent at describing these aircraft and what it was like for the men who flew them. So let me start with the words of Edward Jablonski in his book Flying Fortress. And I quote, "The job of men flying in the B 17 was to strike at military targets. They did this with courage and skill, and their stories are little known. They hated their job, and they knew to fear dread and death. Whatever their varied backgrounds, they shared a hatred of war and a love for their plane. Many recalled the Flying Fortress as the best plane of the air, capable of absorbing unbelievable punishment and still bringing them home." In something unheard of today, Boeing used its own money to design the Boeing Model 299, which was later known as the B 17. Boeing faced an uphill battle in getting the US government to buy its new bomber. Some of that reluctance was due to the US position of neutrality to events that were happening around the world. The Model 299 first flew in the summer of 1935. 2 years later, Boeing was able to sell 13 of its new heavy bombers to the US Army Air Corps. The Model 299 was redesignated as the Y-1B 17. The Y-1B 17 had a crew of 8 and could fly 2,000 miles at nearly 300 miles an hour. The aircraft had 4 Pratt & Whitney R1690 Hornet engines rated at 750 horsepower each and was armed with 5 30 caliber machine guns. The first production model of the B 17 had larger engines and better performance than the prototype and showed promise. Boeing delivered 38 of these B models to the Army Air Corps in 1941. The aircraft was much more powerful, using the Wright turbocharged R1820-51 that delivered 1,000 horsepower each. But none of these B models saw any combat. And prior to the entry of the US into World War II, the B 17 was produced in small batches, all by Boeing in Seattle. Of the 38 C models, 20 were provided to the Royal Air Force in July 1941 under the Lend-Lease program. The B 17 didn't integrate well with the RAF tactics and strategies, so no additional B 17s were ordered by the RAF. The RAF flew the B 17 under the moniker of Fortress Mark I. During the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, 12 of the D models of the B 17 were on the ground at Pearl Harbor and damaged, destroyed in the attack. 12 additional B 17s were airborne and en route and arrived over Hawaii on the morning of December 7th. The Japanese engaged these airborne bombers, and 2 were lost. The remaining bombers had to divert from their intended landing at Hickam to a shorter runway at Bellows Field, where one of them overran the runway. But it wasn't until the E model, with its longer fuselage that included a tail gunner position and the addition of a top turret, all with 50 caliber machine guns, that the B 17 truly earned the name Flying Fortress. The B 17E now had 9 50 caliber machine guns, could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, and had a 3,000 mile range. It had a crew of 10, 2 pilots, a navigator, a bombardier, a radio operator, and 5 gunners, and was considered an offensive bomber that could defend itself. And while the 4,000-pound bomb load was normal, that would vary depending on the mission and the amount of fuel needed. The E model was the first B 17 that was mass produced by Boeing. The F model was very similar to the E model. Once the US entered the war, Boeing could not produce the number of B 17s as quickly as the Army needed them. So Boeing provided all of the engineering and production information to Lockheed Vega factories in Burbank and Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach. Lockheed made 500 of the F models, Douglas made 605, Boeing made the remaining 2,300. The famous Memphis Belle, the first heavy bomber to complete 25 combat missions over Europe, was an F model. Slides aren't changing on me. Give me a minute. There we go. Okay, the final version of the B 17 debuted in August 1943. More than 8,500 of the G model were built, and the G models comprised 2/3 of all the B 17s that were built during the war. The B 17G had 13 50 caliber machine guns, could carry 6,000 pounds of bombs, and had Curtiss Wright R1820 Cyclone engines that were rated at 1,200 horsepower each, allowing the B 17 to cruise at over 170 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. And like the F model, the aircraft were built at the three locations: Seattle, Burbank, and Long Beach. The last B 17G came off the production line on July 28, 1945. In his book, Wild Blue, Stephen Ambrose described the B 24 like this: it was built like a 1930s Mack truck, except that it had an aluminum skin that could be cut with a knife. Steering the four-engine airplane was difficult and exhausting, as there was no power except the pilot's muscles. Breathing was possible only by wearing an oxygen mask, cold and clammy, smelling of rubber and sweat above 10,000 feet in altitude. There was no heat. Despite temperatures at 20,000 feet and higher, it got as low as 40 or even 50 degrees below zero. The oxygen mask often froze to the wearer's face. If the men at the waist touched their machine guns with bare hands, their skin froze to the metal. The idea of the B 24 came out of the government proposal for the B 17. The head of Consolidated Aircraft, Reuben Fleet, was asked to build B 17s under license, but he believed he could build a better aircraft than the B 17. His initial design exceeded the B 17 in all areas and drew the attention of the Allies before the first B 24 was even built. More than 300 of the LB 30 variants were sold for $400 million to the UK and France before the prototype XB 24 even flew. The LB 30s were essentially B 24s without the weapons installed. The B 24 had a similar 10-man crew like the B 17, but flew further, faster, and could carry a heavier bomb load. The aircraft, however, could not fly as high as the B 17. B 24 used four Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines rated at 1,000 horsepower each. And since the US was neutral in World War II until December 1941, only 36 of the initial 340 B 24 or LB 30 aircraft stayed in the US. The B 24 went through a similar evolution as the B 17, with modifications made to make the aircraft more suitable to the mission. The D model was the first of the mass produced B 24s. 2,698 were made, and it made its flying debut in 1942. It normally flew at 20,000 feet at nearly 200 miles an hour. The designer of the consolidated B 24 had to enlist the aid of other heavy manufacturing to meet the orders. So B 24s were made by Consolidated Vultee, North American Aviation, Douglas Aircraft, and the Ford Motor Company. The D, E, and G models of the B 24 were pretty much the same, the main difference being where they were built. The later H and J models had some improvements that made it easier for the gunners to operate in the cramped B 24. And half of all of those B 24s built were H or J models. The later L and M versions incorporated evolving manufacturing technology, and the aircraft were lighter than their predecessors. More B 24s were produced than any other aircraft, and half of all the B 24s were built by Ford. And it was the Buick division of General Motors that was building the Pratt and Whitney engines to go on those Ford built aircraft. Ford's Willow Run plant was remarkable. The plant and runways were built in what was once vacant farmland. Completed in just 14 months, it was the largest factory under one roof in the world, 3.6 million square feet, or the size of 80 football fields. Under the leadership of Edsel Ford, assembly techniques were put in place to produce the complex B 24 at the rate of one every 58 minutes. The last B 24 rolled out of Willow Run on June 28, 1945. In 2010, most of the plant was razed and returned to cement slabs. Today, a small portion of the administrative and aircraft delivery section remains, and it's behind a cyclone fence. The Yankee Air Museum there is hoping to save what remains of the plant because of its great history. When we stack up the most prolific models of the B-17 and the B-24, we find that there are some capabilities that define the way they were used in war. But the list here only tells part of the story. Both aircraft had a crew of 10, robust self-defense capabilities, and could carry similar bomb loads. The B-24 had a longer range, but the B-17 could fly higher. B-17 was a more rugged aircraft and was able to absorb more damage than the B-24 and return home. According to pilots who flew both aircraft, the B-17 was much easier to handle. Several of the B-24s were equipped with radar that made navigation easier. Initially, both aircraft were used in all theaters of war. However, the B-24 became the aircraft of choice in the Pacific theater due to its longer range. Crew composition for the B-17 B-24 was similar, crew of 10, 4 officers and 6 enlisted. The officers flew and navigated the planes and dropped the bombs. The enlisted personnel helped keep the plane flying, operated the radio, and manned the 50 caliber machine guns to defend the aircraft. All enlisted crew members had a backup gunnery assignment. Training was quite different for each crew position, and the length of that training varied. Pilots, obviously, got the most training. The navigators and bombardiers were often those officers who had washed out of pilot training. For the enlisted personnel, the aerial engineer was often the senior enlisted member of the crew and had vast experience in the aircraft. They'd often worked as a mechanic or technician on the ground before they joined the aircrew. The radio operator had training in electronics, Morse code, and radio operations, but also had training as an aerial gunner. The Norden bomb sight was developed and kept in secrecy in World War II. It was a highly accurate device that allowed US bombers to average drops within 1,200 feet of their target. The initial advertisement was that it had a circular error probability of only 75 feet, but in real world, that didn't work out to that. The Norden bomb sight calculated the bomb's trajectory based on the current flight conditions, including changes in wind. Once the bombing run was connected to the autopilot, it allowed the bombardier to steer the aircraft to the target. Bombardiers had instructions to destroy this bomb site if the aircraft was shot down. And when the aircraft were on the ground, special crews with armed guards removed the bomb sites from the aircraft. Once the bomber crew was assembled, they began the once bomber crews were assembled, they began their combat crew training by flying practice missions. They would fire their guns, select their targets, and drop their practice bombs. Once the crews were fully trained, only then would they be sent overseas. Casper was one of dozens of training bases opened throughout the US to train air crews. It was through the effort of the local Chamber of Commerce and the Zephyr winds in the area that brought the Army Air Corps of Engineers to Casper in March 1942 to establish a bomber training base. 6 months later, the base opened. Crews arriving at the base were either there for combat crew training or training as replacement crews. In the spring of 1943, the base transitioned from training B-17 crews to B-24 crews. Training was rigorous. 90 aircraft were lost, 140 crew members killed in the training accident. The base closed in 1945 after training more than 16,000 crew members. The first B-17 raid in Europe was conducted by the RAF using the B-17C, or Fortress 1 as they called it. That was on July 8th of 1941. It was unsuccessful. The RAF soon abandoned their daylight bombing raids using the Fortress 1 because of the aircraft's poor performance. Experience showed both the RAF and the US Army Air Corps that the B-17C, which was used, was not ready for combat and that it needed improved defenses, larger bomb loads, and more accurate bombing methods. On August 12th, or August 17th, 1942, 12 B-17Es struck the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Citadel in France, marking the first US heavy bomber raid in Europe. But months before the US used the B-17 and B-24 in Europe, the heavy bombers were used in Alaska. On June 5th, 1942, Japan began its occupation of the Aleutian Islands of Kiska and Attu. Soon after that, the 11th Air Force in Alaska began sending its handful of B-17s and B-24s on bombing raids to the islands. During one 3-day bombing campaign, the US dropped over 65,000 bombs on the islands. It was the vast distances, in the 1,000-mile-long Aleutian chain, combined with the poor weather conditions that really taxed those heavy bombers. But few other aircraft could operate in that environment. The mix of bombers in Alaska included an LB-30 that was built for the Lend-Lease program but retained by the US. In Alaska, weather claimed more aircraft and crews than the enemy ever did. Later in the war, B-24s began operating from newly built bases in the Aleutians in 1943 and were able to conduct long-range bombing missions on the Japanese Kuril Islands. But even as heavily armed as the B-17 and B-24s were, they were susceptible to attack by enemy fighters. Army Air Corps leaders found that the heavy bombers were not invincible and began looking at better ways to protect them. The first tactic they looked at was to add fighter escorts. This worked well when the bomber missions matched the fighter aircraft range. But early in the war, Germany was beyond the fighter range of the P-47s that were escorting the bombers. Another tactic was the evolution of the combat box formation. This formation was the result of much trial and error and finally adopted in early 1943. At that same time, the P-51 entered service, and it could provide escort all the way. So the combination of this combat box formation, defensive formation that the aircraft used, and escorts with P-51s made the heavy bomber missions much more palatable. The typical mission. The missions often started at 4 a.m. when the ground crews began prepping the aircraft. They check out the aircraft, load the bombs and the ammunition, and briefly run the engines. Wanted to make sure nothing was amiss. The air crews arrived a couple of hours later and did their pre-flight checks and then taxied the aircraft to the runway for takeoff. Then the air crews would do their final checks and do a run up and then move on to the runway as soon as the preceding aircraft had begun its takeoff roll. The aircraft normally launched at 1 minute intervals. Once airborne, they headed for a rendezvous point where they would form into groups, wings, and divisions for the missions. The gunners would fire their guns to make sure they were working, and as the aircraft ascended above 10,000 feet, all crew members would don their oxygen masks. The aircraft grew very cold as they made their climb, and air crew members either wore heavy insulated flight gear or used electrically heated garments to stay warm. The crews would climb to their assigned altitudes, normally between 20 and 30,000 feet, and proceed to their target. At this altitude, they would have to be on oxygen or they'd pass out in 3 minutes. Except for the cockpit, which did have some heating, the back of the aircraft was exposed to those temperatures down to 50 below. Unprotected canteens of water froze solid. Missions were often 8 hours or more long from takeoff to landing. There were no toilets on the aircraft, and the relief tubes that were there were often clogged with frozen urine. There were no coffee pots or food on board unless a crew member brought along some sea rations. It was the lead aircraft that would often determine the bomb release point, fire a flare to let the other aircraft know when to drop. The back of the aircraft became almost unbearable when the ice cold wind blew in from the open bomb bay doors and out through the waste gunner ports. Once the run was complete, the aircraft would proceed to a rally point outside of flat coverage and reform for the trip back home. Without their bomb load, the aircraft were much lighter and could fly faster and higher on the return leg. When the aircraft arrived back at their home station, landing priority would be given to those aircraft with wounded on board and aircraft with battle damage. The ground crews who had prepped the aircraft early in the morning now had to help those air crews off the aircraft, patch any damage, and start getting the aircraft ready for its next mission. The air crews had to debrief their mission and acknowledge the loss of their fellow crew members. Well, not a typical mission. I wanted to talk about one of the more famous B-24 missions, the Pulaski Raid, or what was called Operation Tidal Wave. The B-24 was particularly suited for this long-range mission from North Africa to the oil industry at Pulaski, Romania, where about 30% of the German oil and gasoline was produced. For Operation Tidal Wave, the 9th Air Force was augmented with B-24s from the 8th Air Force from bases in England to form what would be the largest contingent of U.S. heavy bombers to date. Bombers took on extra fuel for the mission and carried delayed action fuse 500,000 pound high explosive and incendiary bombs. For this mission, the U.S. decided to execute a low-level attack so they could avoid German radar. B-24s had practiced low-level bombing in Libya, but this was the first time they engaged a major target deep into German-held territory at low altitude. The low-level approaches created several navigation errors. This led to several aircrews breaking the radio silence to find their way, while that alerted the defenders. B 24s were then met by heavy flak from over 250 guns and chased by more than 150 fighters. B 24s were on a nightmare mission, but most of them were able to continue their bombing raids and score hits on several facilities around Palesti. The toll for the B 24s was high. Only 88 of the 178 aircraft returned to Libya, and 55 of those had battle damage. 8 B 24s landed in neutral Turkey, where the crews were interred. 310 crewmen were killed or missing, and 108 were captured on the mission. But after the mission, 5 Medal of Honors were awarded, 3 posthumously, and an additional 56 Distinguished Service Crosses and 41 Silver Stars were given out to the brave crew members on the mission. Initially, 40% of the oil production capability at Palesti was damaged or destroyed, but without follow-on attacks by the Allies, the production was restored within a month. Despite the damage, the US considered the mission a failure and returned to its strategy of high-altitude attacks for heavy bombers. Just 2 weeks after the Palesti raid, a complex plan to hit the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Regensburg and the ball bearing factory in Schweinfurt was executed by an even larger group of heavy bombers, this time the B-17. The plan was brilliant. Launch 2 divisions of bombers, one slightly behind the other. The first wave would target the Regensburg aircraft plant and unfortunately draw most of the Luftwaffe's fighters. After the bomb run, those B-17s would exit to the south instead of turning west, a maneuver the rearmed and refueled German fighters would not expect. But it would put the Luftwaffe in a tail chase after those B-17s, which would eventually land in Africa. The second wave of B-17s, just 30 minutes behind the first, would head toward the ball bearing plants. The Luftwaffe fighters that engaged the first B-17s would still be on the ground refueling, so that second wave would only have to deal with the flak, not the Luftwaffe. But there's a saying in the military, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. And that's what happened here. In this case, the first enemy was the weather. Low clouds and overcast over the UK delayed the missions. The first wave, led by General Curtis LeMay, finally took off at 0800. However, the second wave, led by General Robert Williams, had not been drilled in the instrument flying that LeMay's troops had and wasn't able to take off 30 minutes later. They took off 3 hours later. LeMay's first wave of 146 B-17s proceeded on the missions. The P-47 fighter escort had to leave the bombers at the German border to refuel. 17 of the B-17s were lost to the Luftwaffe and en route to the target. The surviving 129 bombers dropped 300 tons of high explosive and incendiaries and damaged most of the buildings at the aircraft plant, a successful attack. As they departed the target, 7 more aircraft were lost, bringing the total to 24 aircraft and 240 crewmen. The 3-hour delay allowed the German fighters to refuel, rearm, and to meet those 230 bombers in the second wave. Out of that, 36 B-17s were lost, but they did score many destroyed buildings at the ball bearing plant. 50 aircraft, 500 airmen were lost. Although the missions were successful, the 20% loss rate was unsustainable, and it took the 8th Air Force 2 months to regain the strength they needed for a second assault. Two missions I just described forced the U.S. to review its strategic bombing doctrine. The U.S. bombers were not invincible. They needed continuous fighter escort to deal with the attacks by Luftwaffe fighters. But that would take time. And it wasn't until 1944 that the U.S. strategic bombing strategy and effort would actually tip the scales in favor of the Allies. One of the most successful strategic bombing campaigns took place in February 1944. The Allies undertook a mission to destroy German industry and cripple the Luftwaffe. It was highly successful. The 20 million pounds of bombs they dropped did destroy much of the German military industrial complex, but even more, the Luftwaffe lost 1/3 of its fighter aircraft and 20% of its irreplaceable veteran fighter pilots. It was the U.S. P-51 fighter escort that was the key to the devastating losses by the Luftwaffe. On those missions during Big Week, the U.S. Army lost 200 heavy bombers, 2,600 crew members during that week. Pretty heavy toll, but only a 5% loss for the entire campaign. More than 10,000 or a third of the heavy U.S. bombers were lost to combat during World War II. For the men, each was expected to complete 25, then 30, and later 35 combat missions before he could complete his tour. Some volunteered for additional tours. More than half of the 125,000 men assigned to Bomber Command in Europe were killed, wounded, or captured. During World War II, or during and after World War II, some B-17s and B-24s were used for other purposes. A handful of B-17Gs were converted to SB-17s. They were used by the Air Rescue Service from 1945 through 1956. The SB-17 carried a 27-foot-long, 3,500-pound lifeboat under the forward fuselage. The armament was done away with, and a search radar was added to the aircraft. 4 B-17s were converted to VIP transports and called the C-108. Most famous, named Bataan, was used by General Douglas MacArthur. Other C-108s could carry up to 32 passengers. Other B-17s became targets for fighter aircraft and air defense missiles. The QB-17 was used by the U.S. Air Force Air Defense Command until 1956 as a target for air-to-air missiles like the Sidewinder. And after the war, Hill Air Force Base in Utah converted several B-17s to the RB-17 photo reconnaissance version. The RB-17s were used at the beginning of the Korean War. B-17 variant, known as the C-87, was used as a cargo transport during the war and as a VIP transport after the war. Nearly 300 of the C-87s were produced. During the war, the cargo version was used to fly supplies over the hump from India to China. The C-87 nearly became the first Air Force One, but it was the B-24's safety record that led to the Secret Service selecting the C-54 for that mission. As a VIP transport, the C-87 could carry 16 passengers. So, while a handful of those B-17s and B-24s were retained for special purposes, most of the nearly 20,000 heavy bombers ended up on the scrap heap. After the engines, armament, instruments, and radios were removed from each aircraft, the remainder was cut into pieces and pushed into a large furnace or smelter. Aluminum, the prime metal, was melted and poured into ingots for sale. You could have purchased an obsolete heavy bomber for $13,500 in 1945. The original cost of each aircraft was $200,000. There are a few B-17s and B-24s in flying conditions, and some fly more than others. The Memphis Belle listed here is not the original B-17F that was the first heavy bomber to complete the 25 combat missions in Europe, but it's a restored B-17G that wears the Memphis Belle livery and was used in making the movie. The original Memphis Belle is on display at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Yeah. Some of the bombers listed here make regular appearances at air shows around the country. There are also a handful of additional heavy bombers that are in the restoration process, and hopefully they'll fly one day. For a fee, you can actually fly on the Commemorative Air Force's Sentimental Journey and Diamond Lil. It's really a rare occurrence, though, if you'll ever see both a B-17, a flying B-17, and a flying B-24 at the same air show. There's lots of B-20 or B-17s on display, 24 of them in the US. Several others are on display around the world. One of the best displays is at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. The aircraft on display is the famed B-17F Memphis Belle, which became the first heavy bomber to return after flying 25 missions over Europe. The Memphis Belle had been on loan to the city of Memphis and was relocated to the museum in 2005, where it was meticulously restored and placed on public display just a few years ago in 2018. Here's a list of where you can see B-24s on display. I've highlighted where 6 are on display in the US. Coincidentally, there's also a B-17 on display at those 6 locations. The B-24D shown here in the picture is on display at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton. During World War II, it flew combat missions from North Africa from 1943 to 1944 with 512th Bomb Squadron and was flown to the museum in 1959 before it was put on permanent display. Ironically, the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum in our nation's capital has both a B-17 and a B-24, but neither are on display at the present time. And unfortunately, my own National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs does not have either of the bombers yet. So that's a brief story about US heavy bombers in World War II. If you get to see one flying, you're in for a real treat. And for all of you who thought the B-29 was a heavy bomber, well, it was classified as a super heavy bomber. And that's another great aircraft from World War II. B-29 had 9 remotely controlled 50 caliber machine guns around the aircraft, cluster of 250 caliber machine guns and a 20 millimeter cannon in the tail, could carry 10 tons of bombs, nearly 3 times the payload of the heavy bombers. Each engine had nearly twice the power of the heavy bombers. And it was the first bomber with a pressurized cockpit. So the crew members were able to stay relatively warm throughout the mission. Could fly higher and faster than the heavy bombers. But it was a range of 3,700 miles that made it ideal for the Pacific theater. So, but that's a story for another day. In a little postscript here, I had to throw this in. I had the honor of working with 2 World War II combat cameramen who flew on these aircraft, Dan McGovern and Doug Morrell. They flew during the war, and much of the combat footage that's in the National Archives was shot by these 2 and their colleagues. Much of Dan's aerial footage was used in the 1944 film Memphis Belle, the story of a flying fortress. He flew combat missions with the 305th Bomb Group, survived 2 crash landings, and narrowly avoided being hit by gunfire on a mission over France. During the end of the war, Dan was promoted to lieutenant, sent to Japan to film the aftermath of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Doug was forced to bail out of two planes after taking enemy fire. First time he was shot down over Romania, he and a fellow crew member had to evade capture for 25 days. Next time he got shot down, the Germans made him a POW. And I fondly remember both of these men. So that wraps up the presentation. I'll turn it back over to you, John, for questions.
All right. Thank you. Well, folks, if any of you have questions for Don, please put them into the chat feed. As we wait for those, Don, when you mentioned I think it was the B-17D models at Pearl Harbor, one of one of the veterans that we have a collection for here at the Casper, the Wyoming Veterans Museum, he he actually served on one of those 12 aircraft. He was a career gunner that arrived at Hickam Field sometime in 1940. And if he hadn't been late to breakfast, he might not have survived Pearl Harbor. But he went on to serve with the B-17 Yankee Doodle at Midway. Was later um, a instructor here in Casper, and then later went on to serve on a B-24 crew before being shot down and having to be interred in uh, Switzerland for about a month before the war ended. And that was his name was Leonard Hendry. So he's got an interesting career.
That's one of the things it's really a dilemma when you're trying to tell a story of is it the aircraft or an individual? And I think those individual stories, where they've been related, where they've been retained, are certainly a whole lot more interesting following an individual through the war than just throwing out all the facts and figures like I've done. But you know, we wanted to
So
talk about the aircraft, so that's what I did.
so as we have a question. Um, It's a great question from Tony Morton. How did the planes get from the manufacturing plants in Europe or to Europe? Was it all by air or in groups? How did that transportation process work?
Yeah, the heavy bombers did have the range to make it over. They would go in segments. They wouldn't have a bomb load. They just have extra fuel on them, so they could go either through Canada or when they were going to Europe, uh, would and stop in Newfoundland to refuel if they needed to.
Yeah, we also had I think there was a southern route that went down into Brazil and would cross over to the Azores or somewhere on the before making it up into North Africa.
Mhm.
We had a we have an account of the crew ferrying a bomber over, and then when they got to Brazil, there was someone there to paint the nose art on their aircraft. But well,
Yeah,
I'll ask a question. What was the Air Force's position on nose art? We see today there isn't much, but in World War II and into Korea, the nose art was kind of a big thing, not just with bombers, but with other aircraft. So what was the official Air Force position on that?
well, that's a kind of a tough question. I haven't really looked into all the details on that. What I understand, though, is that you know a crew often flew the same aircraft, and in doing that, there'd be their names, and they'd put on their painting on the side. The I don't think the Air Force really took any look at that or even tried to make up any rules. I think they were much busier trying to win the war than to take care of some administrative stuff like that.
That's a good answer. Well, I don't see any other questions, but Don, thank you very much for uh, sharing the story of these two great aircraft with us today. Um, and we certainly appreciate the time that you've taken to research and look into both the aircraft, the missions, and the men. And I'll plug it first for the folks that are traveling. Definitely stop by the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. I know I need to make a visit at some point. It's been a long time since I was down in that part of Colorado. So, and definitely visit the Wyoming Veterans Memorial Museum here in Casper. All right. Well, thank you very much, Don. That wraps